Hi guys, this is Lauren with Lauren Watkins Art, and today I have a really fun beginner watercolor painting for you. This is super simple and it's a great one to get started. For the colors I'm going to be using Cadmium Red, Quinacridone Red, Gamboge, or kind of a warm toned yellow, Hansa Yellow Light, Sap Green, Ultramarine Blue, Mauve, also known as Violet, and a Burnt Sienna. You don't have to use these exact colors. I just wanted a red that was more pink toned and a red that was more orange undertoned, an orangey yellow and a very light lemony yellow color, a yellowy green, a nice dark blue, and a red brown and a violet. So those are the basic colors. So use whatever colors you have that are close to what I'm using. And then I taped my paper down to a board so that it would be stretched out and it wouldn't warp and move when I was working. And now I'm just taking a mechanical pencil and I'm just sketching out some carrots. I didn't have a specific reference photo I used for this. I'm just sketching out some like basic carrot root vegetable shapes that you kind of see at the grocery store or a farmer's market. I used to work at a fruit stand, and so some of these are ingrained in my memory. But these are just very basic shapes. They're just kind of funky shaped cones. So just have them come to a point at the end, have them round at the top so that you can make it look more like a rounded shape. And then I'm just kind of blocking in the stem where it's going to be green that's coming off the top. And at the bottom, I'm just pulling the point into kind of like a squiggly end. That's to represent the end of the root on them, because carrots are a root vegetable, and so they have a little root on the end if they haven't been processed too much. Now, as you saw at the beginning, I did kind of a color gradation in these carrots. So I had them go from like a reddish purpley color to kind of a very light yellow color. And so I'm starting off with this carrot that's on the furthest left, and it's going to have a lot more purple and pink undertones in it. So I'm just mixing up some of those base colors. So I used my Quinacridone Red, which is very pink toned, and then I mixed it with some violet. And now I'm wetting my paper. Now I purposely did not rinse out my paintbrush very much so that you could see how I was wetting the whole carrot shape except for where the stem is. It's kind of hard to see in video unless I leave the water a little bit toned. But we're going to be doing something called a wet into wet wash. So the paper got wet, and now I'm blocking in this really pink undertone. And on the left-hand side of this carrot, it's going to be more in shadow, and so I'm adding the violets mostly to that side of the carrot. Another thing to keep in mind is that I am doing kind of strokes across the carrot, and I'm keeping those a little bit curved, as you can see what I'm doing right now, and that's going to help keep that rounded shape of the carrot. I used a little bit of my more orangey toned red, my cadmium red, on the right hand side of the carrot, and I'm just dabbing in these colors. They're going to keep flowing and blending, but as I keep adding layers and the paper starts to dry, it's going to blend a little bit less each time. I'm using a paper towel to kind of blot out some excess pigment in areas that I want to keep a highlight in. And that's a great tool for you to use if you have too much water on your paper and it's pooling up, or if you get too much pigment in an area and it's too dark. You just take a paper towel and you can blot it up. For this painting, I'm having it look like the light is coming from the right hand side of the painting, and so the shadows are going to be on the left hand side of the carrot. This is a very simplified shading and highlighting, but it's a great way to get started as you are learning how to paint and how to analyze shadows and highlights. I've added a little bit of green right to the tip of the carrot where the root is the thinnest. If you've worked with a lot of root vegetables, you can kind of see that developing. I'm also using my smallest paintbrush to just add in a few more little lines and details as this dries. This is called a dry into wet wash. So the paper is wet, but the paint I'm adding isn't super wet, and I'm adding it just in small little areas so that it will soften up, but it's not going to blend as much and all over the piece as when I was doing the wet washes earlier. This is a great way to add detail, but have it soften up as it dries. I'm doing my line details on the right hand side of the carrot in a more warm red color, and my details on the left hand side of the carrot in more of a cool toned color, so more of the violets and more of those cool toned reds. And I'm just building up these layers as this is drying, because it's going to keep helping it blend and soften and develop as I work. Watercolors tend to dry lighter than what they appear when they're wet. And so one nice thing about the technique we're doing today, where we start off with a wet into wet wash, then go into a dry into wet, and then to wet on dry, so wet paint on dry paper, is that we can build up the color saturation and value rather quickly, especially on the paper I'm working on, which is Strathmore 400 paper. It doesn't hold on to the moisture for very long, and so it dries quickly, so you can move on to those other layers. So I'm starting the second carrot similar to how I started the first one, where I pre-wet that carrot, got it all nice and wet, and now I'm starting to block in these wet into wet washes. The difference is I'm not using very many violets. I'm not using any violets to start off with on this carrot. I'm mostly using the Quinacridone Red, the pinkish red, and our Cadmium Red, so our more orange-based red. The reason why I'm doing this is because I don't want this carrot to look like exactly like the one I just did. I want it to have that kind of color gradation like you saw when I first showed you this picture. And so I don't want to use all the same colors, especially early on. So I'm just focusing mostly on the various types of reds and possibly just a little bit of orange on this carrot in the highlighted spots. It's the same technique where I did a wet into wet wash, keeping the darker colors and the cooler colors on the left-hand side, the lighter colors and more warm-toned colors on the right-hand side. And then I start building up some more of those details, so starting to block in those lines, the imperfections on the carrot. And I'm just concentrating the shadow sides mostly on that left-hand side, because that's going to be the area in shadow. For this carrot, I mostly just used my medium-sized paintbrush and my small paintbrush. So a size 4 or 6 paintbrush and a size 1 paintbrush for this one, because it's so much narrower than the previous carrot that we painted. Make sure your paintbrush fits the size of area you're working in. If you have a big area that you're trying to wet really quickly, it doesn't make sense to use a tiny paintbrush for that. Get the biggest one you can for the job. It's also nice to make sure you're not using a paintbrush that holds a ton of water if you're just beginning, because tons of water on your paper can make you lose control rather quickly. So I'm just using my 2 smaller ones. My large paintbrush is a size, I think, 12 or 10. So it's for this set, it's the large paintbrush, but in general, it's not a huge paintbrush, but it's big for what we're doing. So it's my large size one. So I'm doing the same process that we just did before. I'm wetting this carrot. I got the other one to a good spot to stop at. And now this one is mostly going to be kind of the warm reds and oranges. It's going to lean more on orange than red, but the reds will be in the shadow areas. And then that Gamboge color, that orangey red color, or the orangey yellow color, is going to be the main highlight. So you can see we already are getting that variation from violets with the first carrot into kind of a warm yellow, and then the last carrot we paint will have the warm yellow and the light yellow colors. So it just makes it visually interesting. But again, it's a wet into wet wash, and I'm starting to add in those lines. I'm making sure that they curve with the shape of the carrot so that they help give the illusion of this being a round shape. And I did my big wet into wet wash. Now I'm starting to work more dry into wet. So I'm not adding as much water in the color that I'm mixing on my palette. There's water in it, but it's more of like the consistency of milk. So it's a little bit thicker. It's a little bit stronger in concentration of color, because the more water you add, the less concentrated the color, the lighter it will be. The less water you add, the darker the color will be in value. It'll be more concentrated, and it won't flow as much on your paper when you add it. So I'm making this more concentrated. I'm making it a little bit thicker so it doesn't flow quite as much, and that it has a stronger punch of color when I put it in, because I'm trying to build up those shadow areas. If you get an area that's getting too dark, you can totally just dab it with your dry paper towel to absorb up some of the excess pigment, like I am right here. You can take a clean dry paintbrush and dab it in that area, and that can help absorb some of the pigment as well. And then I'm just picking up my smaller paintbrushes, my medium and my small one, to start adding in some of those basic details. So I sped up the footage for this tutorial to double speed. So it took me about an hour from start to finish to paint this piece, and I doubled the speed of it. That way I could have it a little bit more condensed format for you to be able to watch. But feel free to pause it at any time so that you can work on and follow along easier. You can also slow the video down on YouTube. The only issue is that my voice will start slowing down and get deeper. So you might want to watch it at normal speed, and then if you want to watch it slower, you might want to mute it so you don't hear me talking rather crazily. But feel free to pause it if I'm getting too fast or I'm going ahead of you. So now we are starting on the very last carrot. So this one's going to be mostly the light yellow and the orangey yellow colors. So I pre-wet the carrot, and I'm doing the same thing that I've done on the other ones, where I'm keeping it lighter on the right hand side with our more lemon yellow, and I am putting in the darker colors on the left hand side. If your yellow is too bright and unnatural looking, you can mix in just a titch of that violet color to neutralize it, because yellow is the opposite of violet, and so adding a little bit of violet to your yellow, not very much, violet's a stronger pigment, can help neutralize it and make it look a little bit less cartoonish yellow. I'm going to be adding violet in a lot of the shadows on the carrots I'm doing. I'm just being very cautious to make sure my carrots are mostly dry or completely dry before I start adding in those violet shadows. That way that violet paint doesn't flow into everything and make a big mess. Violet is a really great shadow color, especially in the color scheme that we're using. And so I'm just adding it right where I want those shadows to be darkest. I'm also doing a few curved lines around each carrot with it to kind of give that impression of like a little indent or a crack within the skin of the carrot, showing off those little imperfections. I'm going to add a little bit of the sap green to the root area of each carrot as well, just to make it look a little bit more realistic. Then I checked to make sure each carrot was dry completely. You don't see that I had paused the video, let it dry completely before I started on this. But now I'm taking some sap green and I'm just starting to block in the little green tops, little green crowns on the top of each carrot. The darker green is just a little bit more concentrated of that sap green. I'm adding a little bit of the orangey yellows to it, so the Gamboge color I'm using, to just help give a little bit of dimension to the carrot. So I'm adding a little bit of yellows on the right hand side of the carrot, where it's going to have a little bit more sun hitting it. And then I'm going to do a little bit of a Sap Green mixed with Ultramarine Blue to the areas that I want to have a little bit more shadow. I'm not being exact with this, but I'm just blocking in those basic green colors to start giving that detail and dimension. One thing to keep in mind is that little crown of green on the top of each carrot. I've rounded the bottom of it. That's going to help it look more rounded and look like it's part of the carrot than if I had cut it straight across and made it a flat line. At the angle we're looking at these carrots at, you want it to have a little bit of a downward curve to help it look like it's part of that basic cylinder shape of a carrot. And so I'm just going to be refining a few more of those details. Everything has dried completely, and I'm just adding a few of those cast shadows from the side of the carrot, from the green stem around it, and I'm just reinforcing just different areas that need to have a little bit more contrast and value. The nice thing about this piece is each carrot kind of has its own specific colors that you're using, and so it makes it a little bit easier to know what colors to use in that piece. So this carrot, I mostly used the Gamboge and the Cadmium Red. I might use a little bit of violet to add a little bit of a shadow, but I'm mostly sticking to those colors. Now I'm going to be adding the cast shadow, or the shadow that you see underneath the carrot and to the side. And I'm going to make the shadow color by mixing Burnt Sienna and Ultramarine Blue and a little bit of violet. Now I'm taking some water. I didn't make it perfectly clear on purpose so that you could see it in here, but I just kind of dragged it along the edge of the carrot, followed its outline. I didn't have it go into the main part of the carrot. I kept a little bit of a gap, and I'm just having it follow that basic shape. And now I'm dripping in the colors. The reason why I'm using Burnt Sienna and Ultramarine Blue is because Ultramarine Blue and Burnt Sienna make a really nice gray color, especially if you have a little bit more blue into it. I wanted it to have a little bit of interest, and so I added a little bit of the violet. Another reason why I love making this mix for gray, so Ultramarine Blue and Burnt Sienna, is that Ultramarine Blue granulates. And so when you mix those two together, the Ultramarine Blue the particles will kind of separate and clump together, and then you'll see almost like a swirl of that Burnt Sienna in it, and it makes it really interesting, and it provides a little bit of texture. And it's really utilizing watercolors in a way that only watercolors work. You only really get to utilize these granulating colors and get these beautiful organic patterns forming in watercolor. You don't get it in pastels, you don't get it in acrylics, and you don't get it in oils. This is part of what defines watercolor and makes it such an exciting medium to work in. So I'm just kind of dripping in those colors, making sure it's darker on the side next to the carrot, since the part of the shadow that's going to be darkest is going to be closest to whatever's casting the shadow. So I have it on the side that is closest to the carrot be the darkest. And then I'm just having it fade out a little bit lighter. These shadows are really what help the carrot kind of pop off the page and look very dimensional and a little bit more realistic. We're not trying to make this painting hyper realistic or anything like that, but we do want it to make it look dimensional and help it be able to be recognized as a carrot. And adding the shadows kind of takes it to that next level without having to do a ton of work. Again, I'm just dripping in that color and just softly blending it out. I have to be a little careful with this carrot because the shadow is so close to the red carrot. So I'm just making sure I'm not getting any water on the main body of that red carrot. And I'm just having kind of that shadow hit the edge of it. Using a paper towel to absorb up any areas that were a little too wet and weren't flowing enough. And just gradually building up the layers to make this look how I want. Something to keep in mind, I don't know if I mentioned it yet, but these carrots were completely dry before I started adding these shadows to it. That just helps me have a little bit more control, so I don't have to worry about the shadow color flowing into like the bright orange of my carrot. So if you have an area that you're going to be adding a really dark color to next to something that's light, make sure that light area is completely dry, and that will help reduce the chance of having like a color mishap. I'm making sure to add a little bit of a shadow where the stem would be casting it. It's important to keep in mind the whole object and the shape of the object when creating the shadows. If you are having a hard time kind of imagining what a shadow would look like, this is where a reference photo can be really helpful, because it can help you learn how light affects objects. And the shadows and the shapes of the shadows can be really affected by how the light is situated. So I'm just blocking in these shadow areas, and I did the Ultramarine Blue and the Burnt Sienna for the main part of the shadows. But the reason why I'm adding the violet is, one, because it makes it a little bit more interesting, but it's also to help bounce around some of those colors that you'll see within the carrots. It's really easy to just say black is the color of shadows with maybe a little bit of gray. But the reality is the color of a shadow is influenced by what's casting the shadow and what's around it, and what color the base area of that shadow is. So the color of a shadow next to a green house or a purple house that is on like brown dirt is going to look different than a shadow being cast by a purple marble on a white table. Does that make sense? Because the colors reflect and bounce off of the objects around them. And so part of the reason why I pulled some of the violet into these shadows is to really help pull in some of those the colors found in the carrots into those shadows. I could have been even more fussy about this and made each shadow color a little bit specific to each carrot that I was doing the shadow for. So having more yellow undertones in the more yellow based carrots and more orange ones in the orange based carrots and so on. I'm not being that fussy or specific with this painting, and I'm trying to keep it simplified, but by adding that little bit of violet, a color that's going to be added to some degree or another to all of the carrots, it really just helps make it look like it belongs to them. Now that the shadows are dry, I'm going to start glazing these carrots a little bit more. So glazing is another term for layering. You're just layering thin layers of paint to adjust and tweak the colors that are already on the paper. So I want to reinforce some of the vibrancy of these colors by doing thin layers of paint over it. I want to add a little bit more detail to them. So I'm just going over them and adding some more fine-tuned details. On this really red-based carrot, I'm coming in with violet and a little bit of that ultramarine blue to create the shadows on it, the darkest shadows on it. And then I'm blending them out with a little bit of just pure violet and a violet color mixed with quinacridone. And that's just helping create the blends and the textures on this carrot. And I'm just taking my time, gradually building up these layers and just taking a step back and looking at it and seeing how they look from a distance. Now I'm mixing up the colors for the next carrot, just glazing over them. I'm adding a little bit of an orange yellow to kind of the highlighted area and really reinforcing the reds, the reddish, the really orangey red colors in those shadowed areas, and adding some more violets to where I want the deepest, darkest shadows. Adding this next layer of color is just adding more dimension. It's adding more texture. and it's adding more value contrast. Generally, the more realistic you want a painting to look, the more layers or glazes you're going to do. On my more hyper-realistic paintings, I can go up to 30 or 40 glazes and layers. On something like this, where I want it to look like a carrot, I want it to feel dimensional, but I'm not going for hyper-realism or anything, then I just do a few layers. If you reach a stage in your painting where you're not sure what to do, or you think it looks great the way it is, I would recommend taking a break from it. So putting it down, going and doing something else, get a drink of hot cocoa if it's a cold winter day, or go work on some other projects and then come back to this. And then you'll better be able to analyze whether there's a few more things that need to be tweaked, or if it's at a stage where you're happy with it. Sometimes if we stare at an object or a painting for too long, we don't notice mistakes. I can't tell you how many times I've worked through a painting and think it looks perfect, and then I'm like, I'm gonna finish this up and ship it to my client tomorrow, and then I come back to it in the morning and see things that need to be adjusted and tweaked before I can ship it off. It's just kind of the way our brains work. It's kind of like proofreading a paper that you've written. If you proofread it too many times in one day, you stop noticing the mistakes you made. But if you come back to it in the morning with fresh eyes, you quickly pick up on your mistakes. So if you don't know what to do on your picture, but you know it's not quite done, or you think it might be close to it, take a break, come back to it with fresh eyes, and then you'll better be able to pinpoint what needs to be adjusted. So again, I'm just coming in, refining those details, seeing how that paint has dried a little bit lighter, seeing what shadows need to be reinforced and darkened, and just fine-tuning the carrots. And I'm kind of bouncing around, because since I'm not working really wet anymore, I'm really done with those super early layers that are really wet, I can kind of bounce around on the painting. So I'm kind of focusing on this far right-handed carrot, the lightest one, the one that has the most yellow in it. And then when I'm happy with that, I can go adjust and tweak whatever I see as necessary. But with it mostly being dry, I don't have to wait for something for a long time for it to dry before I can work on it. I can just kind of move around as necessary. Now, one thing I noticed at this point in the painting was the shadows on the stem part needed to be reinforced. I'd spent so much time reinforcing the main carrot area that those stems were no longer looking like they had enough shadow or dimension to them. So I'm just going in, reinforcing the detail. I'm not making every kind of chunk of stem have the same value, because there's a whole bunch coming out of the top. And so some are going to be lighter, some are going to be more in shadow because they're further back or further on the left-hand side. And so I'm just fine-tuning those details that are going to really help it look dimensional. Once I got those adjusted, now I see what needs to be adjusted on each carrot. So this far, I'm like, okay, these need a little bit more orange shadows to them. So I mixed up a more orangey red shadow with my Cad Red and Gamboge colors. Now I'm like, okay, I need to add a little bit more of a red tone to this far left-handed carrot, and so I'm adding a little bit more Quinacridone Red to it. And I'm just adjusting. And at this point, I'm doing something called dry brushing. So that's where the paper's dry and I don't have very much moisture on my paintbrush. I have pigment, but it's super concentrated and there's not very much water in it. And that makes it so it just barely, it doesn't blend out when you rub your paintbrush across it. It kind of leaves this kind of speckled pattern. And I'm not pushing very hard. I'm just gently grazing my paintbrush over the top. And the nice thing about this is it adds texture, but it also allows you to darken some areas quickly without covering everything. Because I don't want to cover all of those previous layers I added, but I want to darken up specific areas of it. And so by dry brushing and doing a little bit of that over some of those shadowed areas, it creates more of this speckled effect where some areas are darker, some areas are lighter, and it's not completely smooth. I just really like that effect on the carrot, and you can kind of see how some of these last strokes I've done haven't been perfectly smooth or blended. I think it really helps add that texture that makes these carrots look maybe a little bit more realistic, because carrots that haven't been peeled are a little bit more coarse and bumpy than what we're used to seeing at a typical grocery store. And then I'm just adding these last few details. I'm almost done at this point, and I'm just kind of taking a step back. I'm walking away from the painting every so often and seeing what it looks like from a distance to see what things need to be fine-tuned and adjusted to make it really stand out. I'm softening up some of the harsh lines from the shadows that had formed. Some of the violet had kind of stained the paper, so I tried blending it out. It didn't blend out super well, but it wasn't a big deal. And I declared this painting done, and I signed it. So this painting is the first of a series I'm going to be doing for the next few weeks that is related to the watercolor course I'm teaching at a local university. So this is one of my first watercolor lessons that I'll be doing, and I'm going to be posting this video a few days after that lesson for any students that happen to miss the class and for you guys on my channel. So stay tuned. There will be a lot more watercolor lessons that are at the beginner level coming out on my channel. This is what the carrot looked like close up. And if you have any questions about techniques I use, colors I mix, anything like that, please leave them down below and I will do my best to answer them for you. If you want to stay up to date on when I post a video or start a new series or anything like that, please hit the subscribe button and notification bell. That will make it so YouTube notifies you when I upload new videos. I will see you next week with another beginner watercolor video, and I hope you have a fantastic day. Bye.